Night fell in the Leary Valley without making it any darker. Smoke from days of fighting drifted level with the ridgelines, and the ruined Benedictine Abbey on the mountain looked like a broken tooth against a sky lit by gun flashes. At 11 p.m. on May 11th, 1944, Polish guns opened together, hundreds of pieces firing until the hills trembled and dust poured from old stone like breath. In a slit trench below Hill 593, a private from Lwów pulled a scarf from his pocket, kissed the edge without meaning to, and waited for the signal. He had crossed half the world to stand here. Arrested by the Soviets in 1940, worked past hunger in a camp he did not describe, released when the Germans turned on their former partners, formed into General Władysław Anders's army in the Middle East. His country erased from maps, and his home behind a border that had been moved without asking him. When the whistle blew, he climbed. The slopes of Monte Cassino are steeper than they look from the road. Rock breaks through thin soil, gullies channel everything downward, and the Germans of the 1st Parachute Division knew every fold. They had turned the ridges into a machine, sighted machine guns on reverse slopes, wired approaches, zeroed mortars on the only places a man could crawl. The abbey above had been bombed to ruin back in February. Its stones were now cover for the defenders, not sanctuary for anyone below. The Poles in the first wave moved through scrub that sparked under tracers, boots scraping limestone, breath rattling loud in their own ears. The men they followed, the Indians, New Zealanders, Americans, French North Africans, had bled on these same folds in earlier battles and stopped because the hill would not allow more. The first night was a blind climb toward names the maps made simple: Snake's Head, Phantom Ridge, Hill 593, Hill 569. Polish platoons from the 3rd Carpathian and 5th Kresowa divisions fought yard to yard in places where a yard took an hour. Grenades blew men backward into thorn. A squad reached the crest of 593 and held long enough to count the stars before counterfire snapped the ridge into shards and pushed them off. Runners went down, and messages arrived late or not at all. When dawn came, a patrol realized they had advanced so close to the abbey that they could read the numbers on German helmets through a gap in the stones. By the second night, the men learned the ground by feel. They taped spare grenades to the straps of their helmets. They tucked letters into the tunic pockets they could reach without thinking. Chaplains crawled forward with morphine and whispered prayers that sounded like orders. A medic pulled a tourniquet tight on a boy from Wilno who had lied about his age and told him to keep his mouth closed so his teeth wouldn't break. Mortar shells found the only level space near a mule track and cut 3 mules down along with the men beside them. The track stayed passable because someone dragged the bodies away before the next team came through. In Anders' headquarters, the map pins moved with less drama than the real fight. Reports came in wrong by an hour. A company that was marked in place had been wiped out. A platoon that should have been gone held on in a fold of ground just shy of the crest. The orders remained the same. Keep pressure on the heights, draw the enemy, open a path for the British and Canadians to break along the valley, force a general German withdrawal when the line cracked somewhere. Anders visited forward posts when the light allowed, a calm figure in a coat that never seemed to fit the weather, asking small questions. Are you getting water? Are the fuses right? Did the wire go through? Because the big question had only one answer: continue. On May 17th, a hot wind shoved smoke out of the gullies for an hour, enough to show the slopes like a nightmare with the lights turned on. The Poles moved again, past cairns they had stacked for their own dead 2 nights before. At Hangman's Hill, men who had been cut off for days waved with the limp hands of the starved and pointed toward the abbey. They had been drinking from canteens captured in night raids and counting rounds like currency. Reinforcements reached them and held while the line to the left fell back, then surged again when company commanders stood to be seen. At Hill 593, a major from the Cresoa division, grinned without humor and said he had been trying to take this rock since his mustache had been black. This time, his men got over and stayed on the top, fighting hand to hand among stones with numbers chiseled on them by monks long dead. The Germans were still there, disciplined, lethal, moving from position to position, with the neatness of men who had spent months building them. But the plan around them was failing. To the west, British and Indian divisions pushed along Route 6. To the south, French-Moroccan goumiers climbed goat tracks the maps had ignored and rolled up positions at night with knives and grenades. The line that had looked fixed since January didn't break so much as loosen, and when it loosened, the defenders at Cassino could not hold without losing the ability to get out. At dawn on May 18th, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Uhlans worked forward through rubble that used to be prayer and stone. The air smelled of dust and cordite and the faint rot of things caught in walls. No German fire met them. They passed through the hole where the great doorway had been and crossed a courtyard filled with broken columns and empty, blown-open books. In a corner, a few wounded paratroopers raised their hands. At 10:20 a.m., the Poles raised their banner on the ruins, a white eagle against red, and a British flag followed. On ground where every yard had been paid for, the signal ran down the slopes like a message written in heat. The monastery was taken. The costs had faces. In a gully below Snake's Head, a sergeant from Krakow, who had survived the winter march out of the Soviet Union, sobbed once when the shell that killed his friend did not touch him. A priest who had been a lawyer before the war knelt in a shallow scrape and read last rites over 6 men without asking their names because they were no longer able to speak them. In a dressing station behind the lines, a nurse from the Polish Red Cross held a hand until the pulse slowed, then turned to the next cot because the tent would not empty by mercy alone. The Polish Second Corps took Cassino and left thousands of their own behind the stones and in the valley cemeteries. When the road finally opened and the Gustav Line fell back, convoys rolled north toward Rome. The ruins stayed behind. For the Poles, there would be no road home in the way the word should mean. Their corps had been built from men deported east when Poland was divided in 1939, from prisoners released to fight when alliances shifted, from boys who had learned to read in schools that changed their language overnight. They had taken their oath under a flag that diplomats now treated like furniture to be moved at a conference table. At Yalta the next winter, the map was drawn again without asking them. Many would not return to a Poland occupied by the power that had once starved them. They would carry their battle honors to new lives in Manchester, in Glasgow, in London flats and Canadian farms, in places where their names were mispronounced and their uniforms were hung in closets with cedar blocks. The dead did not travel. On the slope just below the abbey, at the Polish War Cemetery, white crosses stand in ranks facing the mountain. For our freedom and yours, the inscription says, the promise that ran through their columns like a wire. In the spring, wildflowers grow between the stones. In the summer heat, the white eagle on the monument throws a short, sharp shadow. Visitors read the ages, 20, 22, 26, and the towns that no longer belong to the country engraved beneath them. In a corner lies the grave of the general who led them. Anders asked to be buried there with his soldiers. When they brought his body in 1970, the veterans who had fought up the rocks decades earlier stood straighter than their backs allowed and saluted a man who had kept his word to the last. Local Italians tell their own stories. A farmer who had hidden in a cave during the battles came out to find his field full of shell fragments and Poles offering chocolate to his children and asking in broken Italian for water. A woman kept a postcard a soldier pressed into her hand that day, a view of Lwów she would never see. The new monastery, rebuilt from memory and scaffolds, stands over a valley that does not forget even when the guidebooks turn the fighting into a paragraph. When historians write about the road to Rome, they count divisions and days. When the men who climbed the rocks spoke of it later, they remembered smaller things: the roughness of the limestone under their palms, the way a comrade's boot slipped and a hand found the heel in time, the silence between artillery salvos when the only sound was the clink of gear and the scrape of breath, the moment the flag went up and the shooting, for a heartbeat, seemed far away. They fought to the end of their strength for a state that existed in oath and memory more than on any map, and when the smoke cleared, they stood on a mountaintop that proved they still existed too. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.